Just days into President Trump's 50-day peace deal deadline, Russia issuing threats over America's support for Ukraine. The deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council saying, quote, "The statements of Western politicians on this topic are complete nonsense. We need to act accordingly to respond in full and, if necessary, launch preemptive strikes."
Yep, you heard that right. Former Russian president and the current head of the Russian Security Council is calling for Russia to preemptively strike the US. You see, he has a habit of drinking too much and he forgot to study history. It's never a good idea to preemptively strike US. Here's what he said in an interview with TASS, a Russian state-controlled magazine. Russia needs to strike first rather than wait for attacks from the alliance because the West still has not only treachery running through its vein, but also a sick and deeply outdated notion of its own superiority. And we need to behave accordingly, respond in full measure for Western elites. An independent, strong Russia has always been a historical anomaly and a very convincing refutation to their civilizational superiority. What is happening today, a proxy war, but in essence a full-scale war, sanction packages, and loud statements about militarization of Europe, is yet another attempt to destroy the historical anomaly hated by the West, our country Russia. Medvedev said that Moscow, having started the war with the aim of demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine, gave it a chance to stop being a pawn in someone else's bloody geopolitical game, adding that it is also necessary to conduct deparasitation in Ukraine. Now, why is he saying that? Is he actually going to attack the US or NATO? Well, no, he's not that stupid. This is nothing but the good old Russian saber rattling. They've been doing this every time West steps up their support for Ukraine, and they're doing it again. And it's the same old rhetoric they've always been using. We'll escalate this war even further. But in reality, Russian military doesn't have the strength to escalate this war other than using nukes. And Putin does not have permission to use nukes from Xi Jinping, the senior partner in Russia-China alliance. Now, this is something we recently discussed with General Ben Hodges in our most recent interview, so let's listen to that clip. But first, like always, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button down below. Whenever we cover Russian videos, Russian bots have a habit of disliking our videos to kill its reach in the algorithm, so your likes and subscribes really do help us out. Now, let's listen to the clip. Talking about the deadline, I don't know if you saw this report 10 days ago. Axios reported that President Trump and Putin had a call. In that call, Putin said that he's going to go for like another offensive, escalate the war heavy to try to gain more ground. Is that like, can they even escalate the war minus like all the nuclear stuff? Because I highly doubt Russia has any ability that they're holding back, all the while they have lost more than 1 million people in casualties.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. I don't know what else they can do to ramp up, the war effort. They can only keep killing innocent people with their drone strikes and missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. The Great Black Sea Fleet, which has a really cool name, is not even in the picture at the moment. The Russian Air Force does not dare to fly into Ukrainian airspace. They still have not been able to interdict equipment and ammunition coming from Poland into Ukraine, which is an incredible failure by the Air Force. I don't see any way that they're going to overwhelm in a major way Ukrainian defenders. I think we're going to keep seeing this attrition, this pushing, but for minuscule. I mean, thousands of people are getting killed for, almost nothing in terms of territorial gain. Now, it will be interesting to watch as more North Korean troops come in. Are they at such a number, and do they get employed in a way that begins to make a difference on the battlefield? We're still talking about people that are on foot or they're riding in golf carts and motorcycles and that sort of thing. So there's not like a big armored formation that's going to break through, penetrate, go all the way to the Dnipro River, and then keep going to Kyiv or encircle Kherson. These kinds of things. I am not seeing any of that sort of capability. And there's no doubt the Russians have gotten very good at using different types of drones, My Ukrainian friends tell me that they really hate the glide bombs. I mean, those things are devastating. But none of that is decisive. It's terrible if your house or your town is getting hit, but this is not the kind of stuff that's going to determine the outcome of the war. And I'm just not seeing that, at least not for the next year, unless something really significant externally happens one way or the other.
If you want to see the whole podcast interview, you can watch that by clicking the link in the description or in the card above. Now, what's laughable about this Medvedev interview is the fact that he's calling for a preemptive strike on NATO, but on top of that, in the same interview, he's denying that Russia has any plans to attack Europe. He's calling it nonsense, which European countries are actively using that excuse to ramp up their military spending. When in reality, Russia is spending more on its military in terms of their GDP than any other country in the world except for maybe North Korea. They are spending nearly 9%, and this spending has been so bad for the Russian economy that even the state-controlled newspapers in Russia are now criticizing it and calling for officials to do something to fix the economy and inflation. Here's the report on that.
Well, once again, lots about the economy this morning in the Russian papers. Top story in Nezavisime Gazeta: to pay utility bills, some Russians are falling into debt. From July the 1st, utility tariffs increased on average by 12%. Sociologists and financial analysts note growing public concern at the rise in utility bills. According to a poll by the Public Opinion Foundation, in the first week of July, the number of Russians complaining at a marked increase in their communal and utility bills rose by 1/3. Also, bread prices rising, wheat prices falling. The rise in retail bread prices is outstripping consumer inflation. Annual inflation reached 9.45% last week. Bread prices rose by 15 to 17% in annual terms. As far as Russia's wheat exports go, according to the Russian Grain Union, in the first half of June, Russian wheat exports fell by nearly 5 times to 565,000 tonnes, compared to 2.7 million tonnes in the same period last year. The Grain Union expects the same trend in July.
Before we dive in, let's talk about a major challenge in understanding international news: perspective. A single article may not reflect what's happening on the ground, and journalists might not be an expert in the region. That's why cross-referencing is essential if we want a clear picture of global events. That's where today's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. It's an app and website that pulls together coverage from over 50,000 sources across the political spectrum. For every major story, they provide a complete overview, including bias rating, ownership, and credibility scores. Take this story for example. Russia launches largest aerial assault on Ukraine. F-16 pilot killed as Zelensky urges U.S. support. Ground News found over 400 articles on this story, and over 80 of them come from highly factual sources. That alone makes it one of the few places I trust to quickly verify what's being reported and how reliable it is. When you're trying to understand sensitive geopolitical stories, knowing the information is actually credible makes all the difference. As someone who has been covering that Russia has no intention of wanting peace, it's good to see fact-based reporting about how Russian attacks have only gone up since the negotiations started. And their blind spot feed is one of my favorite features. It shows you which stories are being ignored by one side of the political spectrum. Knowing what isn't being talked about is just as important as what is. Check them out at ground.news/basics or scan the QR code on your screen. The link gets you 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. I use it daily, and I think you'll find it just as useful. The Russian economy is already struggling, and this is exactly why Trump's warning about secondary tariffs on Russian oil exports is such a big deal. You see, ever since Putin launched his senseless invasion, the only saving grace for the Russian economy has been its shadow fleet and the oil that Russia is exporting to countries like China, India, Brazil, and of course Turkey. And now the Trump administration is trying to go after that revenue source. You see, the secondary sanctions will not be on Russia, but rather all these countries that are buying Russian oil. And that's why every country is truly worried. Now, many people are calling for why is there a 50-day wait? Why not just do it right now? That's why in this next clip, we have none other than the NATO General Secretary, Mark Rutte, explaining why there's a 50-day wait in terms of secondary sanctions. Let's listen in.
So now there's a 50-day deadline. Essentially, the president put that on the table today. And you think that the sanctions on other countries doing deals with Russia will create additional pressure, exponential?
Absolutely. This is significant. So today, if you are in Beijing or in Delhi or you're in Brazil and you know that this is coming to you, you might want to call Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and say, hey friend, we are still buying stuff from you, but you have got to get serious when it comes to these negotiations on a ceasefire or a peace deal, or otherwise we get hit by these secondary sanctions. There will be also an effect directly on Russia, of course. But this is really significant, and it is smartly designed by the president.
You see, let's just assume China, India, Brazil, they like Russia, but at the end of the day, they will never put Russian interest over their own interest, over their own citizens' interest. You see, both China, India, and even Brazil, they export a lot of stuff to the United States, and if the sanctions are placed on these countries because of them buying oil from Russia, that's just not something they're gonna accept. You see, they're not gonna take on a punishment just so they can continue supporting the Russian war, which they don't really care as much about. What I really mean by that is China, India, Brazil, they want to buy Russian oil because they're getting it at a discount. But they didn't really care much for Putin winning this war or Putin even surviving this war. They were happy to get oil for a discount. But if that discount is coming at a cost of the American market where they're exporting so much of their goods, so much of their country's jobs are dependent on those exports, they're gonna stop buying the oil. And in fact, we're already seeing signs of this. Oil ministers say this publicly. Let's listen in together.
In February 2022, when the military conflict between Russia and the Ukraine commenced, we were buying, if I remember, 0.2% of our overall crude from the Russian Federation. Today, yes, you are absolutely right, it has gone up considerably. But equally, during this period, India has diversified the sources of supply, and we have gone, I think, from about 27 countries that we used to buy from to about 40 countries now. But more than that, if you go into should you buy from a source 1 or should you buy from a source 2, we have been clear from the day go that we will buy from wherever we have to. Because the Prime Minister's commitment is, in the final analysis, to his consumer, to the Indian consumer.
Now for Russia, this is all very bad news, especially at a time where they need to be pushing as hard as they can before the sanctions come in. And that's why, what is Putin doing? He's lying to his own citizens. All the while the economy is going to shit, the food prices are going up, Putin is blaming it all on Ukraine. The Russian economy is suffering because of Ukraine. That's what Putin is telling his citizens. Listen in to this Russian lady who's saying that food prices are going in Russia all because of President Zelensky. It's truly comical.
How would I know? Does our government care about pensioners? Of course not. What's the cause? How would I know? The war, basically. Everything goes there. All the money goes to the war. What should be done? How can the situation be fixed? Zelensky needs to be removed. Then everything will be fixed.
And things are about to get worse for the Russian citizens who are already struggling, and hopefully this puts more and more pressure on Putin. I say this because the EU has just passed one of its toughest sanction packages yet. This package is also going after the Russian oil revenues very heavily. The price of Russian oil is now strictly limited to $47 per barrel, approximately 15% below the average market price over the last 3 months. The sanctions package also includes a ban on transactions relating to Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines, meaning Russia plans to rescue this infrastructure through US are now futile. Russia hopes of blocking the adoption of the new package with the help of Hungary and Slovakia also did not materialize. So Slovakia received a guarantee of protection against gas supply disruptions until 2028 and supported the EU joint decision. Against this backdrop, India announced its readiness to replace Russian oil with Middle Eastern oil, as we just heard. how this will affect the Russian economy. In coming months, the budget generating oil and gas revenues should fall sharply. Inflation will accelerate and ruble will weaken. The room for circumventing sanctions is narrowing. If India switches to alternative suppliers, this will deprive Russia of a market share that is extremely important to it. The introduction of sanctions on Nord Stream operations shuts down potential loopholes and Moscow's investment maneuvers to return to the European market. The Kremlin understands the severity of the economic consequences of continuing the war, but is not seeking a political solution. Russia understands that US is also considering the possibility of imposing new sanctions, and there are currently no signs Putin is ready for de-escalation and a genuine peace talk. In fact, the Russian situation is so bad that the Russian head of the Council Committee on Budget and Financial Markets is now publicly calling for a tax increase on the Russian population that's already struggling. Why is he doing that? Well, to fill the gap in the Russian budget that has been caused by declining oil and gas revenues and worsening economic situation. The good old Russian habit of just raising the taxes on poor, like the Tsar did it, Putin is going to do the same thing. Here's the statement by the head of the Russian Budget Council.
We are alarmed by the avalanche-like growth of accounts receivable, which has increased more than fourfold over the past 5 years. Therefore, given the more pessimistic economic forecasts and the decline in oil and gas revenues, we will now need to urgently begin budget consolidation. First and foremost, we must mobilize all available resources to increase the revenue base. We have a high level of shadow employment, and the issue of gray wages remains unresolved. We are puzzled by our persistent unwillingness to address privatization matters, which represent significant reserves for budget replenishment. At the same time, we need to consider reducing ineffective tax benefits, the volume of which is constantly growing and already accounts for about 1/3 of federal budget expenditures. What clear sources of expenditure optimization do we see? It would be reasonable to postpone the execution of funds allocated to reserved national projects by a couple of years, since they remain unspent due to the unpreparedness of certain activities and other reasons. At the same time, we must keep in mind all protected budget items. For example, we cannot cut spending on national defense, and, on the contrary, we will most likely have to increase it.